Sutzkever was, of course, a great poet, probably the greatest Yiddish poet who ever lived. And my second book of translation was a book of his, an anthology of his, called Von alte und junge Xavierden, which means from old and recent manuscripts. And I translated the book in the early 1980s, and I subsequently learned that he didn't want to give me permission to publish it. Now, I asked why. I guess he didn't think I amounted to enough to warrant publishing his book. So I later got to meet him when I went to Israel on a visit, and we spent a couple of evenings in his apartment. And when he was here in New York, he spent one evening having dinner with me in my house, and I knew him reasonably well. I called him on the phone a year before he died, when he was already dying of cancer. He was a very interesting man, and of course, as I say, a great poet. He was an odd mixture of cool and warm. He, at first approach, he was sort of forbidding and cool. When you got to know him and talk to him, he was really quite nice. The first time I met him, before I met him in Israel, he had come here for an evening in Yossel Molotik's house. He came to New York, and he holed up in a hotel in Manhattan, and I was assigned to go fetch him in my car and take him up to the Bronx to Yossel's apartment. So I went to the hotel, and I parked the car, and I went up to his room, and we were chatting about nothing special for about 10 minutes. And he suddenly stopped me, and he said, "Ihre Eltern kommen von Ukraine." Your parents come from Ukraine. He had an ear for language, but his ear failed him at that time. Because while it is true that my parents do come from Ukraine, I, or they, do not speak Yiddish with a Ukrainian dialect. And I always wondered why that was, until I read in my father's autobiography that his paternal grandfather came from Mogilev, which was White Russia. So they spoke Litvish Yiddish, not Ukrainian Yiddish. So the great poet and linguist misconstrued my Yiddish accent. Nevertheless, he thought that was what it was. Then we went up to the meeting, and it was a typical literary evening. People were reciting things and whatnot. And I was asked to recite one of his great poems, which is called Lieder zur Lunatikerin, which is songs to a lady moonwalker, which is the way I translated it, or to a sleepwalker. And I translated it. I read it in Yiddish, and I read it in English, my translation. One of my good friends, who happens to be still living, another poet, leaned over and whispered in my ear something very heretically, says, "Your translation is better than his original." So I thought that was charming. I never said that to him, of course.